1,000 times better. Thank you for the suggestion to leave and rejoin. Um,
Wonderful.
yeah, so I'll just jump back in. Yeah, I run a studio called Optimistic Design. It's a design research and strategy studio. And I also teach at the University of Washington's Human-Centered Design and Engineering program, helping students consider a systems thinking approach to design. So the big reason that I'm here is to talk about my experience with my book, Closing the Loop: Systems Thinking for Designers. And my usual audiences for my talks and workshops are designers who have unfamiliarity with systems thinking. So I tend to share kind of a 101 perspective. But today I'm really excited to talk to you all. You're all systems practitioners with a background in design. And I want to talk specifically about what I've learned about that intersection of design practice and systems thinking since I've written my book, and kind of based on the feedback that I've gotten after writing my book from other designers and systems practitioners. So I want to give a little bit of context and background as to how I personally ended up in this space of systems thinking and design. Rewind several years ago, as a design consultant, I was doing kind of an interesting array of projects in a few different sectors. I was working on projects in tech, specifically emerging tech with large technology companies. And at the same time, I was doing a few projects in global development, specifically in healthcare. In addition, I had some civic design projects in the mix. And so these are projects that ostensibly had little in common aside from the use of human centered design as an approach to problem solving. In tech, I felt like the problem solving and innovation was really oriented toward the success of a product from an individual user perspective. And of course, through the lens of profitability. And this seemed to leave just kind of all the potential problems out of the equation. So, for example, how marginalized populations could be harmed by technology products, um, how a lack of familiarity with cultures could lead to tragedy, and how personal use of technology could connect to negative societal outcomes. And these are all just like examples of, different types of headlines we've seen over the last several years when it comes to technology and its outcomes, just to name a few. Now, in global development, it felt like HCD was too narrow an approach, despite good intentions towards positive change and outcomes. And unlike tech, it does feel like a space in which people are often thinking about multiple perspectives, end users, implementers, funders, policymakers. However, in spaces in which I was working, the HCD approach often meant reducing innovation to kind of a singular silver bullet technology device centered solution. The work I was involved in often felt a little bit like, you know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Project One Laptop per Child initiative, which is a global development project associated with the hubris of technologists. And likewise, I remember around the same time working on a civic design initiative, and my team and I came up with an idea for a service-based solution with various touch points that had multiple stakeholders. And the reality was that in order for a client's government organization to get funding, they need to have something that they said was basically an app. Like, we need a digital experience with screens. And so even when we as designers weren't thinking narrowly about solutions, oftentimes our stakeholders were, or were pushed in that direction. And much of the work reminded me of a thought experiment presented by Atul Gawande, who wrote his book Being Immortal. I highly recommend it. In it, he describes the results of an 18-month study that was focused on geriatric care for patients older than 70. And some of the results, as compared to patients who receive standard care, patients who receive care from geriatric team were a quarter less likely to become disabled, and half as likely to develop depression. And they were 40% less likely to require home health services. And he goes on to talk about how those were stunning results. And he says, if scientists came up with a device, call it an automatic defrailer, that would slash the likelihood you'd end up in a nursing home or miserable with depression, we'd be clamoring for it, and Wall Street would be bidding up company stock. Instead, it was just geriatrics. And because humans are more interested in other forms of innovation, geriatric programs, particularly in the US, are being defunded left and right. And this really resonated with me when I read this book because it often felt like it had so many parallels to the type of work that I was engaged in as a designer. Um, as a result, I felt the HCD process was falling short of these disparate spaces. And that was both disappointing and frustrating because I've been an HCD practitioner for decades and have really felt like it's a useful and creative approach to problem solving. Um, and, you can see yourself. I think some of the issues are really baked into the process itself. This is the double diamond. I'm sure many, or if not all of you, are familiar with it. And there are various framework depictions of human-centered design um, and design thinking. All of them present a linear, usually kind of funneling process, which automatically feels like the narrowness of thinking is necessary and is inherent to the processes we engage in. So I've often thought that systems thinking, not just the tools, but the philosophy could be a way to expand how designers think about both the status quo and how to change it. And I started framing this mindset shift, the broadening that has to happen before someone can actually start effectively integrating systems thinking tools into their practice. And for me, the starting point was to articulate where human-centered design was falling short, because human-centered design, particularly in the technology sector, is even more narrow and presents itself as user-centered design. I consider, these three things to be the most prevalent shortcomings. So first, the user-centered design process does not acknowledge nor address potential harm. I think you can kind of see that in some of the stories I shared earlier. Secondly, a user-centered design approach limits the potential impact of design. So oftentimes designers, particularly in the technology space, are engaged in problem solving that is meant to create, for example, like delightful user experiences, but maybe are somewhat disconnected or actually contribute to the harm that I mentioned in the first point. Um, I think, like, for example, infinite scroll is a really good example of that on social media platforms. And in fact, Asa Rayskin, who came up with infinite scroll for Facebook, was like, has kind of like regretted how the kind of impact that sort of design decision has made. And lastly, a user-centered process does not inherently take into account systemic forces. So thinking about just how users, individuals in a moment use a product, as we all know, does not take into account the systemic forces around it and the context in which products and services often fit. So when I first wrote the proposal for my book, I really wanted to write the book I wish I had when I was a designer struggling with how to integrate a systems thinking mindset and systems thinking approaches and methods to my work, especially those that I was engaged in these very different spaces as a design consultant. And it made me think about a lot about this quote from Koi Vin, a design leader who had this blog, subtraction.com. And he said, "We can't think of ourselves merely as disruptors. When we take on a challenge, we have to commit ourselves to producing complete, viable, and sustainable solutions. We have to finish the whole job." And really, he was talking about technologists. He wrote this essay specifically about Uber and the systemic impact it's had on cities and transportation, and yet how the technology organization itself was like focused on basically kind of disrupting a market and not really kind of thinking about the implications of that work. And the starting point I realized was not entering systems thinking through tools, but through a systems thinking mindset. So, for example, considering how things are interconnected, how cause and effect is not just immediate, and how systems with which you are concerned go beyond the space in which you individually are focused on as a designer. And these are all ways that designers can expand into a systems thinking mindset. And through that, design practitioners can then make the invisible visible through systems mapping methods, stakeholder facilitation, and strategic thinking. Um, so, core to the reframing into a systems thinking mindset, I thought about how to combine the concept of systems thinking to incorporate or envelop the human centered design process. So, if you think about HCD, of having more of an inherently circular process as we did earlier. So, this is just kind of the D school model redefined as a circular process with empathized, divine, ideate, prototype, and test. And I thought about it like how would this integrate within a systems approach, not just be like left out of a system approach, but how could it be integrated into it? And in this example, I've added lens broadening steps such as expand, as in expand who you consider your stakeholders in the system to be. Imagine, as in imagine several types of potential approaches to problem solving. And lastly, after the stacked up design processes, evaluate. So consider what has changed once you've considered several different types of solutions or interventions within a system. And within that process, we acknowledge the concept of multi-finality through the various design processes that might take place. What's missing from this sort of framework that I was working on are other possibilities for change that are not within a typical HCD process, like policy decisions or incremental change that doesn't necessarily need a discover or prototyping process. So I do think like kind of engaging in this way is a way of speaking to design practitioners in taking the familiar and kind of adding a contextual lens around it that starts speaking to more of the work through more of a systems thinking lens. In addition to my own book, of course, I often recommend others that I find really helpful specifically for designers who don't have great familiarity with systems thinking, such as Donella Meadows' book, David Peterson's Systems Thinking for Social Change, and Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline. And I know there are many other references in my book to other thought leaders, such as Mike Jackson and Peter Chaklin, but I find these texts to be really approachable for design practitioners. And it's funny because, like my students, for example, will read many of these texts and they really like the ideas within it, but they find it really hard to activate within sort of like a design practice. And I tend to hear this over and over again with design practitioners today, especially those who really are in kind of like that narrow lane of interaction design, user experience design, and are individual contributors within their organizations. So, since writing my book, I think I've learned some things, just different perspectives from design practitioners, a realization of a stronger point of view when it comes to my own design practice, and also things I would further emphasize as I continue to talk about the intersection of human-centered design and systems thinking. I myself don't look at myself, I just like don't think of myself as a systems thinking expert, by the way. I think of myself as a designer first who engages in systems thinking to as a means and a lens through which I do my work. And I don't know if like that's necessarily a shared lens that other folks have, but it's kind of the place where I'm coming from when I wrote this book. And so the first thing I've realized since embarking on this journey is that for many practitioners, mindset needs to come before methods. This seems like a no-brainer, but it's actually so hard to disrupt the mindset so inherent in many design environments, especially those situated in tech, and to sort of disrupt these kind of ideas of, for example, techno-optimism that are really central to the philosophy and ways of working within many organizations. So if we take Peter Cheklin's framework of hard systems versus soft systems, I think of the work I do in combining systems thinking with human-centered design as having a focus on soft systems. And one of my favorite metaphors when sharing with designers and technologists the notion of hard systems versus soft system thinking is clouds versus clocks. So especially in tech, where my background sits, and the domain in which most of my book's audience lives, there is a philosophy and approach that's centered more on hard systems type of problem solving. So Karl Popper's description of two types of problem spaces, clock problems and cloud problems, feels relevant and illustrative here. So the typical approach in technology is treating things as clock problems. And these problems have clear elements that work together. You can take it apart and put it back together. You can isolate and reduce problems based on the components involved. And this is a very software engineering approach. And however, lots of problems that involve the intersection of humans and tech platforms, as well as societal impact, are cloud problems. And these problems are, they're nebulous. Clouds are literally nebulous. They move in our dynamic. They tend to be complex systems that are interconnected and they adapt and change. And the thing is, as designers often work within engineering cultures and technology organizations have cultures that stem from engineering, of course, we take the same reductionist view that all of the things we're working on are clocks. And the reductionist view for engineers, building something is not necessarily bad. That's how we get things to work. But designers also need to think about how to navigate clouds and cloud problems. And I find this metaphor helpful in explaining soft systems thinking for designers. And I think many of the problems in tech end up manifesting when people who come from this sort of cloud problem solving space get into a space where they have to make decision about cloud problems. An example I've seen is Twitter, and how someone like Elon Musk kind of treats the Twitter space. Well, it's now he now calls it X, but it's kind of like those kind of social problems, etc., the social dynamics inherent within Twitter, within X. Um, he likes to think about them as these kind of like component based engineering type problems, and that doesn't work when it comes to human behaviors and how we acknowledge human behaviors. So you see this all the time happening in technology, where it's like taking that sort of like engineering mindset and trying to put it into these sociocultural spaces, can actually result in a lot of unintended consequences. A second reflection that I hadn't quite realized is that positionality would be a concept that was new to many designers. I think there's often an assumption from designers that they're kind of outside of the system, and this is for just like practitioners in general, right? When you're building and creating things, you're designing for, and it's often what we think of as parachute design. But something I try to remind people of, especially design practitioners, as a function of having an equity centered design practice, is that they are of and in the system and not outside of it. And that they hold power through their ability to both analyze and problem solve. And in order to understand a system and collaborate with others who want to change it, we need to recognize who we are in contrast to others within the system. First, like I try to help people understand that they're weird. Like I know I'm weird in the traditional sense, like, my kids certainly think so. But what I'm referring to is the acronym from Harvard professor Joseph Henrich to describe those who are Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And once you start to think about it, you can kind of see how many products and projects, not just like one laptop per child, but also products like Google, like Facebook, etc., they are being used by many different cultures around the world. But those who are tending to make the design decisions fall into this weird category. And that the very framing of the need of digital technology as being necessary is very framed up in a Western way. So one thing I encourage with designers is that in order to engage in systems thinking, it's important to acknowledge where you sit when it comes to power, privilege, and incentives. And this is a power and positionality wheel that we use in our practice, especially when we're working with folks based in North America. It shows one's proximity to power using a sociocultural lens, and I found it to be a good framework for having those discussions about the power one has in the system as a practitioner. Um, so, for example, I do a lot of work in education, and so we have to think about who are least served by today's systems. And where I'm from, that means children of immigrants, Black and Latino children, children experiencing poverty. And now, as a designer, you can think about where you sit on the wheel versus the most marginalized of those who are considered end users or end beneficiaries of your design solutions. And this is what it means to start noticing and reflecting on inequities in your work and among your stakeholders. And it's really a question of who historically holds power versus those who don't, and trying to change and shift that in your work. And one way to kind of start shifting that is through a focus on the participative principle, or participatory methods. And practitioners sometimes don't recognize the importance of or forget about other stakeholders in the systems analysis and planning process, including myself, as I kind of got started in my journey in systems thinking, because there's often a lens we use in the design practice is to go away and design something and then come back and have things designed for people or for a group. Mike Jackson and Torto's System of System Methodologies describe the participative principle as, if possible, all the stakeholders should participate in the various phases of the process Stakeholders here include representatives of purposeful parts of the system and of the larger system. So this also means engaging stakeholders like lived experts in designing for the future. He says again, the idealized future is a statement of the system the planners, stakeholders would create if they were free to create any system they wanted. If pursued positively, it can lead to the interests of different parts of the organization itself, and of the wider society being reconciled. This is interesting because I think many design practitioners tend to view activities such as systems mapping as a kind of solitary or intradisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary activity. Um, just like thinking about how it's often taught in schools or programs dedicated to systems thinking and systems mapping is focused on the mechanics with very little emphasis on who should be involved and have power and collaboration within the process. Outputs are often expected to be quite complex systems maps that are produced through a designer taking inputs from other stakeholders, producing an artifact, kind of like this that I'm showing you, which is a systems map I actually worked on, and then validating it or gathering feedback once again from stakeholders. And practitioners are often surprised that I emphasize that rather than creating a map like this in isolation, you should do systems mapping with system stakeholders. I think for many of you in this room, that's probably obvious, but I was really surprised that people don't do this when they're kind of first engaging, particularly in system thinking. It's not just just don't engage just the decision makers, but also those who have the least amount of power in the system. And it can be with much easier and accessible tools that others can align on. So this is why I emphasize accessible participatory tools such as stakeholder maps and iceberg models, because as designers, you can engage in deep thinking, but collaborate while doing so. And the tool itself, in many ways, is secondary to the alignment that happens among the stakeholders with varying levels of power. And I also hear from lots of designers that systems thinking is quote unquote not in their lane, meaning they don't feel empowered to engage in it, especially if they're, say, a junior individual contributor. And I think these kinds of tools make the practice of thinking in systems accessible to them as well. Um, I was in a call once, and there were like sort of educators who work at the other educators who work in the intersection of system thinking and design, and I remember saying something like, I don't do a lot of like causal loop diagrams anymore. Like I just like we almost never do them lately in our projects. And somebody literally gasped. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize that was like super shocking because like I don't think for me it's about the mechanics necessarily. It's like really about the alignment and how you engage the different stakeholders at different levels and varying levels of power within the system. So quickly adaptable mapping frameworks and the why for using them works better for design practitioners, I think, or at least those that I work with, than super deep methods that require extreme practice change. And breaking it down as well in a way that design practitioners understand, this kind of maps, like what you're looking at here, kind of maps the HCV process, but sort of meta, um, through understanding the status quo, so foundational research, generative research, and envisioning the future, engaging in definition and ideation, for example. And this helps to adapt from a narrow design centric mindset to a way of engaging and thinking in systems. And my last sort of major reflection is that I believe values are at the heart of systems thinking and design. And I don't know that I made this as explicit in my book as it's become for me, um, because of my practice of running an equity centered design practice. And I often share this cartoon where these people are saying, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And I often share this as an example of the potential failures of design and the myopic nature in which we practice it. But I also think it applies to systems thinking when systems thinking is applied cognitively and separated from values that are not oriented around profit and capitalism. And I do think that for some, there is a cold abstract lens through which you can practice systems thinking, perhaps disconnected from oftentimes the broader human experience. Perhaps it's used explicitly to consolidate wealth or to reinforce the status quo of power and inequality. Um, and in leading a design practice focused on equity, I've made it a point of view of our practice that we are not agnostic in the ways we're using systems thinking and design as tools. I love this diagram from systems thinking for social change. I think it outlines for me what is at the heart of systems thinking when it intersects with design. And it speaks to an intentionality around preferable outcomes to use the term from speculative design practice and not just for a subset of those who hold power. And that, that sort of aspiration is vision, mission, and values. And so I view system thinking as a tool that is explicitly connected to trying to achieve more equitable futures. To me, it's not agnostic to the concepts of fairness and justice. And in fact, it helps to establish a clear point of view. And I think, based on what I've seen from this conference, many of you in the room is like, this is not new to you, but a lot of this, it's really interesting for me to kind of see in the design practice at large that people want to sort of cognitively disconnect the methods from the reason to use the methods in my mind, which are which are the values and mission and vision. So in my practice, we're not using system thinking as a means of increasing and maintaining profit and power, but to figure out how to focus on outcomes that mean increased equity for those who are marginalized. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this William Gibson quote, "The future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed." And it's often used to describe the technology landscape. And I think in order to truly design for the future, we need to consider the long-term implications for everyone and not just the wealthy few. And the correction of current inequities requires systemic change. And so for me, in system thinking means fundamentally disrupting the status quo, not just working in service of it. I also think about, Ted Chiang, the writer. I heard him say, "I tend to think that most fears about AI are best understood as fears about how capitalism will use technology against us. And technology and capitalism have been so closely intertwined that it's hard to distinguish the two." So lately, I've been doing a lot of work in our practice around, strategic work, often framing the use of AI. And I think about this quote and how it relates to taking a systems level approach to understanding, designing, and using AI and other emerging technologies. Um, so one thing that I sort of try to keep in mind in our practice is this idea of freedom dreaming. And Dr. Bettina Love, who writes about educational freedom, she coined this term freedom dreaming, and it's dreaming about a system that is free from today's oppression. And I think that's what I'm hoping to do in adopting a system thinking mindset and also a participatory and participative mindset is working with diverse stakeholders to dream about and move the needle towards systemic change using design as a tool, as an optimistic tool to kind of help us get there. Um, so those are kind of my takeaways, and I would love to hear just what some of you think and like what you've encountered as well. Also, if you're curious about my journey of system thinking as a designer, I have a nice little RSD symposium. It's like a 20% discount on my book. So yeah, happy to connect and answer questions.
Wow, really fantastic and fascinating. I think we're going to have a lot of interesting reflections and questions. But first of all, just allow me to thank you for this wonderful expose, Cheryl. I think covering so much interesting ground that we encounter as designers and as systemic designers. First of all, we heard you talk about encountering, sort of engaging with these, things that we've heard sort of through our own practice and training, sort of being questioned and criticized to some extent, user-centered design issues, do they focus on potential harm? How might we navigate them? You presented a very interesting concept of multi-finality, and I really appreciate your emphasis on mindset than methods. And I think this is a theme that's really, increasingly emerging, it has been emerging in RSD and other communities. And, your point around challenges to disrupt, the prevailing ideas, techno-optimism and connecting to Karl Popper and the clogs versus cloud. And so you've kind of, I think, really invited us into very rich space for discussion and discourse. So with that, let me just open it up to the group. Any questions, any thoughts? I think Mieke, hi Mieke, nice to see you. Go ahead, you have the first question.
Thanks, Gordon, and thanks so much, Cheryl, for your introduction. I actually read your book, and I think it's a really accessible way for designers to get to know what systems thinking can bring to a design practice. And Goran was already mentioning the idea of mindset, which I also think in your book has a prominent role. And I was wondering, as a designer, once you've gained that mindset and you're actually applying systems thinking in your projects, then you will also have to engage the other stakeholders in this systems
Mhm.
thinking mindset, which I often find is a really difficult thing, to get over that first threshold. So I was wondering if you have any suggestions for practicing designers on how to then kind of, I don't know, transfer this mindset or open stakeholders' minds to this new way of thinking.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Thank you, Mika, for that question because yeah, we're of course like sort of reinforcing some of what I was talking about today. We as designers are not working in isolation, right? We're working with other, disciplines, other teams, decision makers. I work with a lot of executives, for example, and yeah, not all of them hold kind of uh system thinking mindset in the way that we can connect and espouse it. And I think one way or like a beginning entry point is like oftentimes with those kinds of audiences who are kind of new conceptually to this idea of system thinking, as I mentioned, like I like work with a lot of organizations that are kind of like have this very techno optimistic lens, who are very like super narrowly product focused. And I think having these exercises around, say, a futures wheel, are really interesting exercise for them to engage in because, or like I mentioned, the iceberg model earlier. I've done that with teams where it kind of gets them out of this headspace of just thinking like directly about narrow solutioning and more into the space of like understanding context and kind of like different layers of context. And that's oftentimes a good entry point. And I know this like sounds a little bit contradictory because earlier I was kind of saying the methods are not the entry point, the mindset is the entry point. I think for others, oftentimes if you are trying to get them to think outside of their kind of normal approach to things, using some of these accessible tools and frameworks can be a really good way to get started in that area. And then also synthesizing your work so that it's oriented towards a systems lens by maybe using some of those kinds of frameworks as a communications tool is also a really good way to start communicating sort of these more systems level considerations, and trying to get out of that sort of narrowly focused space. So I think like if you're sort of embodying that mindset, it's like you can start with like teaching others the methods first, and then like also introducing to the mindset with these themes of interconnectedness, causality, and wholeness. And I do think there are things like there are these sections in my book that I call system spotting, and I think they're really useful for practitioners to kind of think about as like where when you're just kind of like experiencing your day, are you experiencing like systems in the real world? Like why are there sidewalks here but not sidewalks there? Kind of just like looking at things and thinking about things like infrastructure. And as and Donnell Meadows also has kind of like a recommendation towards this in her book where she just looked at the newspaper and tried to see kind of like systems examples in the newspaper. And that's like those are really good exercises. And maybe they're even warm up exercises for your stakeholders who aren't engaging in systems thinking mindset.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful question, and thank you for that wonderful response. So, Shivani, Ashley, and Kyle.
Thank you so much. My name's Shivani. It's good to meet you. And I'm so excited to check out your book. This has been such a phenomenal talk. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned a little bit earlier that you are a designer and not a systems expert and kind of talking about systems thinking for design. I'm exactly the opposite. I am a systems thinker and a systems expert, and I am very like much less familiar with design and trying to bring the kind of approach the same problem, I think, from the opposite space of what does it mean to make systems more human-centered. And my work is really through conflict and relational skills, but I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what you wish systems experts knew new about design and kind of the opposite of what you've been talking about. If you've been working with systems folks and you're trying to give them that more design approach, is there anything that you wish we would know about design and the design approach in our work?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you, Shivani. And I feel like I've definitely had friction with some systems practitioners, especially when kind of talking about the tools. And I'm kind of like, you know what, I use the tools in my practice that are most useful. And I've had some practitioners, more than one, come at me with like the iceberg model is not systems thinking. And I'm like, okay, well, I think, maybe, yeah, maybe it's not. But I do think from a mindset perspective, it is a way to get, design practitioners and as well as like the other kind of stakeholders I work with to expand their lens beyond just themselves. So one thing that I would love for systems practitioners to understand about designers is that there really are like design practitioners in general, and I don't mean to make like sweeping generalizations, so please like speak out if like there's disagreement on this front, but they're often take the lens of like user or like end user advocacy. And so kind of introducing ideas of how to think in systems, kind of starting with that lens of like this look at like humans behavior context and how they experience things. And oftentimes like just because of my background in interaction design, that's oftentimes at an individual level rather than kind of at that collective level. And so that's kind of like what's missing is this idea of kind of looking at collective experiences, nuance, and context. And designers are very focused on individuals and maybe how they experience objects, artifacts, products, services, those kinds of things. And so that's kind of like the headspace in which they live. I think also just kind of like both teaching and running practice, I do feel like designers often struggle with the abstraction of systems thinking, not just like the mechanics, but the abstraction. So thinking about things through the lens of forces, for example, instead of through like a human and what a human is going through is like that's a really hard leap to make a lot of time. And it's yeah, it can be really challenging. I think that's why like especially when I teach designers how to do causal loop diagramming, for example, it's like really difficult for them to kind of get into that space of making the connections on that level. I also think it might be worth like noting that a lot of the design research that goes to inform design, like design solutions, design decisions is often qualitative in nature. So it's like, contextual inquiry, doing interviews, etc. I'm teaching a class right now where I'm kind of teaching these things, and I'm just like wishing like we had more of a systems lens on all of this. And I'm like, as I'm teaching it, I'm like, oh, how do we make this a little bit different so that it just like engages some of this. But yeah, I think those are the kinds of things that I would think about if I were trying to say like, hey, you want to understand like designers and kind of the lens that they often bring to the table. Those are some of them.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Wonderful question and great response. Thank you so much, both. Over to you, Ashley, and then Kyle.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question that came before from you, Shivani, because I'm actually in between both. I have a background in design. I used to design spaces, retail environments, and then I shifted into system change or system thinking, and now I am more, I guess I sometimes call myself a system change designer because of my inner like design in me. But more kind of system change consulting if you look at the like products that I actually deliver or like the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. And I'm trying to find the connection between the two because it makes so much sense to me that design thinking and system thinking are connected. But the thing I struggle with the most is like the projects that I have available to me are not connecting the two. It's either doing a system map and the person that wants me to do that is an investor where they want to invest in the system. Or, I mean, I haven't really done any design or what I would call system design or systemic design projects because they've been kind of just design projects. So I guess, have you come across a starting point where it's interesting actually, Eddie, you said that you come from it from a perspective, I'm a designer using system tools. But have you come across a projects or examples where the two are combined at the core of the mandate of the project, if that makes sense as a question?
Yes. Yeah, this is such a good question because I get this question a lot from particularly design practitioners. So like, I don't even know, like, where do I even integrate this kind of work? Where do I even integrate something like a systems analysis when I'm kind of designing like an end user product? And like you're saying too, like there's these other types of projects where you're doing like the systems analysis and it's like not necessarily connecting at that sort of more like almost like individualistic solutions level. And yeah, what's interesting is like the work, a lot of the work that I'm doing now does combine the two things. And what's interesting is you had mentioned investors. It is coming from investors who are kind of like looking to understand the system and potential like areas of investment. This is for like philanthropies that are kind of investing in education. That's like the space that I work really heavily in. But they want that sort of like system stakeholder lens. And so we do a lot of design research, like working to help elevate the voices of, let's say, students in education, especially marginalized students, to help inform investments. And so the investments piece, sort of the solutioning piece, we often do kind of like systems analysis where we're kind of thinking about where are the different potential leverage points within a system where we can make change. But it's also informed by what are we learning from and how do we have system stakeholders like students or like teachers participate in the process. And so that might be an entry point, is like thinking about how do you involve the types of, what we might think of as end users or end beneficiaries within the design process more in a participatory role within systems thinking, because you then have to translate it into this sort of like illustrated or real world experience through a real world experience lens. And that means thinking about specifically solutions or thinking specifically about the context of something through that sort of human like stakeholder lens. So that's usually how we integrate our work. And then oftentimes we're sort of tinkering with prototyping kind of potential solutions and working with system stakeholders to test those solutions. So doing the systems analysis, like kind of taking that bird's eye view, but then like funneling into different potential solution spaces. And so for you, it could be illustrating experiences during like an inherently sort of like systems change project, and engaging the people who would be affected by those potential changes or those potential solutions. And yeah, we found it really interesting, and it really brings a human lens to sort of like project work that might otherwise just kind of live at this like kind of abstract systems level.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. And just such wonderful reflections on how we as a collective of practitioners are really working across and interconnecting these dimensions of design and systems thinking, and how they kind of interpenetrate each other and inform each other in a kind of a more cohesive continuum. So thank you so much for that. Over to you, Kyle.
Thank you. I actually had a very different question in mind, but I want to pick up on the thread that Ashley just left with, and that I consider myself a trans-contextual designer. I moved from process engineering, which was too linear, to service design, which was also way too linear, into complex adaptive systems. And I was in a position about a year ago where I could start hiring people into a team, and we could start building around this organization. How are we going to do narrative inquiries and do strategy around these complex systems? And then the culling happened last year, and all strategy started to dissolve from big organizations. But what occurred to me is we don't have a really good language or a good rally point for all of us to come together and talk about this work and how it fits in. I oftentimes find myself referring to it as this work with air quotes. And I'm wondering what you're finding that trend is, and maybe what the trajectory is in terms of like where this is coming together and how it's fitting into the world. Because I see a lot of really amazing people doing great work on islands. And we know from this work that coming together and diversifying these experiences and putting changing those connections just creates more and more. That's where the emergence actually happens. So how do we build on that?
Yeah, I love that as well, because yeah, I'm just having when you mentioned service design, I was thinking about how like it's actually really hard to hire practitioners with this intersection of skills, because I do think like design as a practice is so it's kind of identity oriented, right? And so people really put themselves into specific lanes of design that, are more like, I'm an interaction designer, or I'm a design researcher, I'm a design strategist. And it's been really interesting. Sometimes when I'm looking for practitioners, I list, let's say, like a description as like, I'm looking for a design strategist. I get all sorts of different sort of strategy, like I get mostly business strategists actually, like when I do that. But what I found is service design, service designers have the most kind of, I guess it's like a Venn diagram, uh, intersection with a designer slash systems thinker. And but I can't like list something as like I'm looking for a systems thinking designer or a systems designer, because that manifests in very many in different ways as well. I'll end up getting people who specifically design systems in technology, for example. So yeah, I feel like there's something emergent here in terms of like that designer as identity kind of space that hasn't quite been, I don't know, locked in, solidified yet. I think you fall directly into that space as you're saying. And so I think that is a question for the folks in this room. What is that? What is this called? Like how do we move it into this space of like like that design discipline identity kind of space, as well as like you had also asked about like where do these things seem most relevant. And I think it's like, yeah, it's like the place where I work, for example, is within a very complex domain, education in a very complex domain. And it's just kind of like I learn a lot of system thinking from people who don't call themselves systems thinkers, honestly, and within that space, who have to acknowledge kind of just like the different stakeholders in the system, the different system forces, etc. So there's a lot of like translating of like methods within that space. But yeah, it's a super good question. I don't have the answer for it, but I love, yeah, you should be thinking about it and kind of like add definition.
I can't stop thinking about it. It's an affordance we
Yeah.
haven't figured out yet. The language is an affordance. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely.
Wonderful
I
question
think.
and reflection. Go ahead, Cheryl.
I
Oh,
was going to say,
go
just
ahead.
quick
Go ahead,
to
Kinsey.
follow. Kyle and I found each other a couple of years ago, and it's been just a lifesaver. I put in the chat that I feel like I'm on a desert island. And this is my first time at an SDA thing, and it feels like home in a lot of ways. I'm an anthropologist and ethnographer and specialize in African studies and arts and cultural policy. So it's kind of a weird background to bring to this. And about, what do we call this kind of area? It's interesting because we all identify with something that is not in the nomenclature necessarily in what we're talking about, wanting to come together in. It's hard to just talk around it, but if it gets too formalized, then also it can be kind of restrictive sometimes.
Yeah,
and part of the
I totally.
process of finding each other and maintaining those distinctions, but at the same time, that's the richness of it. And so I feel like that's what has yet to be named, that which cannot be named. So
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Also, like, just like really quickly, I want to draw attention to Stephen's comment in the argument. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Victor Papnik's work, and I feel like there is this movement from designers, not as producers, but designers as facilitators, and I think that's where, like many of those of us who identify as designers now live, especially when you're working at the intersection of system thinking and design. And Goran, I think we're at time, right? So yeah.
I think so. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, great discourse and questions. The next session is starting right about now, and let's continue the conversation in other formats. Thank you all so very much. See you in the next session.
Thank you. Connect with me online.